The Game Designer's Playbook, Chapter 4, Feedback Design. At its core, interaction is communication. Interaction is fueled by the exchange of information, and when this exchange succeeds, it blends into the background of the larger experience it supports. However, when it breaks down, it becomes the subject of frustration. The communication of information is a subject inextricable from every interaction we experience, and game interaction is no exception. Two-way communication between the game and the player is what drives the cycle of player action and game reaction. And there are many different categorizations of the way games communicate with us. One is placement, like whether a piece of information is given to us inside the game's world, like a character shouting, or outside of it, like an icon on the HUD. Another is type, such as whether the information in question is a number or a description. We might even categorize by importance, depending on how essential different pieces of information are for players to know. For the purpose of organization, we'll be loosely separating communication based on when and how it occurs. First, there is information about a game state that is conveyed continuously, often outside a game's world. This includes an always visible UI element showing players how much health they have left. We refer to this as continuous communication. Second, there is communication that occurs in direct response to player action or significant in-game events, often inside a game's world. An example is a red flash when a player takes damage. We refer to this as responsive communication. It is important to note that the same element can serve up both continuous and responsive communication, such as when that always-on health bar updates in response to damage. It's communicating responsively. Referring back to the core model of game interaction as discussed in Chapter 2, we can think of continuous and responsive communication as the first and last steps of that model. First, players obtain information about a game state via continuous communication. Then, they decide what to do and act on that decision by providing input. The game processes this input and finally provides responsive communication that helps players to inform their next decision. Each and every transfer of information from game to player can influence a player's actions and the experience they have. In designing our means of communicating information to players, several questions must be answered. What do we need to tell players? How will we represent information? What do we need to do to grab the player's attention, and so on? We'll explore how to do all of that, but our first order of business is understanding the tools we have at our disposal for communicating with players. In other words, how people process information. Communication and the senses. While it's common to think that humans have only 5 senses, the truth is that depending on how you define sense, the list of human senses is somewhere between 7 and well over a dozen entries long, including such things as balance, temperature, and pain. These channels all serve the same core purpose of transmitting information. In theory, any of the senses could be co-opted to communicate information during gameplay, and we'll explore this concept with 2 key senses, vision and hearing. Humans are often described as visual creatures. Our sight allows us to jump between concepts quickly and rapidly identify sudden changes. In games and elsewhere, there are several visual cues and channels that can be used to communicate information to the players. The ones we'll be looking at are text, shape, size, color, and motion. Text isn't just for labels and subtitles. If used well, it can provide snappy feedback that players understand at a glance. Something as simple as stylizing text for a game over can say a lot about your game. Shape creates meaning in a game from a combination of existing game conventions, real-life parallels, and its own in-house elements. Probably the most recognizable use of shapes in games is to encode information using icons in a game's HUD. Icons play off our cultural and real-world associations to convey or imply meaning at a glance without relying on language, such as health, stamina, or magic. Icons might function as labels, creating less clutter and taking up less space than text, while also eliminating the need for a translator. Icons can also serve double duty, simultaneously telling you what they represent and its current state. Furthermore, repeating a symbol can help to build associations in a player's mind. Size implies power in a game's world. The giant tower in the distance is probably significant, and the boss you're fighting right now is probably a much bigger character. Many of our existing associations with color can quickly convey information. For instance, red might mean morning, heat, or something related to health. Looking at the bars on the right, the mapping of colors that first come to mind is probably red for health, green for stamina, and blue for mana. Motion can grab players' attention, alerting them to sudden changes. Intense motion should generally be used sparingly to avoid overwhelming players or creating a false sense of importance, but motion doesn't always have to be extreme to be effective. Relatively subtle animations can be used to telegraph enemy attacks, and slight motion in a game's UI can be used to tell players how quickly something like an energy meter is depleting or refilling. As an example of telegraphing, an enemy might squish down before springing back up to take a bite out of the player. Hearing is quite distinct from vision in that we are incapable of easily turning it off. Humans may be visual creatures, but we are also creatures profoundly impacted by sound. Just as there are different ways to communicate information visually, there are also different ways to communicate information with sound in games. The ones we'll be looking at are speech, sound effects, music, and ambience. Speech can be used not only for conversation and voiceover, but also for feedback. An important thing to remember here is that voice lines can quickly feel repetitive if overused. In general, you should exercise caution if using a limited collection of voice lines to provide frequent feedback, and give players the options to adjust or disable vocal feedback while providing alternate means of conveying the same information. Sound effects occur in response to some event or change, whether in a game's world or its internal state. Spatial audio, which uses stereo sound to tell players where a sound is coming from, can provide important guidance or warnings in-game. Music is far more abstract. Outside of rhythm games, there's rarely a simple one-to-one relationship between the features of a game's music and its events. Instead, the character created by melody, instrumentation, tempo, and key communicate the feeling of the current situation. Ambience can also add character to a game's world. Though you generally won't be using ambient sounds to convey strategic information to players, they can still be extremely effective in communicating the nature of an environment and, like music, help to build the right mindset for players as a result. Although sight and hearing are the easiest senses to appeal to, we are not limited to these channels alone to convey information in games. Something commonly seen in games these days is haptic feedback, which is communicating information through touch in games. Controller vibration comprises a majority of the haptic feedback that most players will experience. VR development is an area where haptic feedback has become increasingly relevant. Since many games in VR rely on mapping their controls to realistic motion, haptic feedback can help lend in-game objects a sense of weight and force. The channels we choose to convey information will be heavily dependent on what the information is and its importance. Usually there are multiple viable solutions to communicate any given piece of information, with creative freedom playing a significant role and no singular solution existing. Nonetheless, we can apply some general rules of thumb based on what we are trying to communicate. At a very high level, we can identify 3 basic types of information you might convey to players: quantities, descriptions, and locations. For each data type, we can establish some general guidelines in how it may be represented to players. Here, we'll be focusing primarily on audio-visual cues. If you want players to have a relatively accurate idea of any number, it must include some sort of visual representation. If an estimation of the value is sufficient during gameplay, then you can opt to use a proportional display, like a meter that fills or depletes as the value changes. Many games use these types of displays to represent character health. For descriptions that require substantial detail, such as the function of an item, some form of text should usually be included. Simpler descriptions, such as the type of an item in the player's inventory, might be easily conveyed through iconography. In general, icons are preferable to text if their designs are easily interpretable. As an exercise, let's explore how we can use descriptors to make this panda look friendly. If we want players to think this panda is friendly, we can use iconography, shape, color, friendly music, or even a combination of different elements. It can be straightforward to convey location. Oftentimes it can be as simple as showing the player where something is. Icons on a compass or minimap are certainly the most straightforward way to communicate the location of something in any game where the players navigate a virtual space. Spatial audio, however, can be incredibly effective and can be used when giving players an explicit map location would be inappropriate. Audio can also be used in situations where players are meant to discover a location with the assistance of something like an in-game radar. Another distinction we can make is that each of these data types can be involved in either continuous or responsive communication. For instance, a player's remaining health might constantly be displayed on screen, but sudden changes in that value will carry additional responsive feedback, such as animations and sound effects. A key difference between continuous and responsive communication is that continuous communication serves as a reference for players, while responsive communication serves as an alert. This means that, in general, continuous communication should be unobtrusive, avoiding things like excessive visual motion or loud audio effects. Responsive communication, on the other hand, should grab players' attention using things like sudden visual change, sound effects, and haptic feedback. Keep in mind that the type and intensity of the channels you use to represent that information will affect the noticeability of that information. Using intense sensory cues for something trivial can both annoy players and reduce their sensitivity to communication for information that is genuinely important. Conversely, if communication never really grabs players' attention, then critical events can easily be missed. Continuous communication and HUD design. There is a wealth of information that we can communicate to players at any given time. We have already examined how we can represent these individual bits of information in isolation, but how can we create a cohesive way to continuously communicate everything that players need to know? Players will have constant access to information in 2 main ways. First, they can hear and see things in the game's world through their point of view. Second, you can selectively feed information to players through a virtual interface you design. In other words, a HUD and in-game menus. Depending on the game and the situational context, players' informational needs will change and our design must adapt accordingly. And since players will spend a good deal of their time staring at the HUD, Its contents can have a significant impact on players' moment-to-moment experience. Too much information can create visual clutter and spoil a game's aesthetic. On the other hand, missing information can cause player frustration. These things are hard to determine, and individual preferences can mean that certain decisions will leave some players unsatisfied. Perhaps the most critical step in creating these designs is the simplest, selecting which information to communicate in the first place. How can we possibly go about deciding what needs to be communicated and what should be ignored? As a player, you want to know everything that you need to make good tactical decisions. As a designer, it is your job to make sure that players can access everything they need to know, while also paring down the mountain of information that might be displayed at any time into something manageable. We have multiple options at our disposal for the availability of information. We can identify 5 different cases for when players have access to information: always off, always on, contextual, on request, and customizable. For always off, players are never given this information. Conversely, for always on, this information is constantly available and actively communicated to players. For customizable, players can choose whether and/or how information will be made available to them. For on request, this information is given to players only when they request it. For contextual, this information is typically silent, but automatically communicated to the player in certain situations. Depending on the game, a mix of these choices for different pieces of information is often appropriate. Unfortunately, there is no game-agnostic way for us to neatly choose among these options based on the type of a piece of information. We should approach the problem of what to communicate by examining the context and importance of information, rather than its type. Understanding an information's importance can help us determine the best way to represent it. For any given piece of information, we can select an appropriate option by answering the following 5 questions. Number 1. Should players be able to know this information? This question is about balancing what makes sense in the context of a game's world with what information needs to be available for a game to work as intended. Information that a character wouldn't necessarily know might still be something that players are able to do for the sake of reducing confusion and frustration. Number 2. What do players need or want with this information? Certain pieces of information are always needed and should thus be always on by default. Examples could include things like score or time remaining in an arcade-style game. Players might need to know something in certain situations to decide on their next move. For something that players may want to know from time to time, but is not strictly necessary, information should be available on request. Number 3. How important is this information to the player? More important information should be readily available, whereas less important information may be kept at bay to avoid overwhelming the player with clutter. Number 4. Can this information be conveyed outside of the HUD? The HUD is not the only channel for continuously communicating with players. Players will also constantly take in information from a game's world. Number 5. Should we give players control over the availability of this information? The answer to this question is almost always yes from a design standpoint. Practically speaking, it is often treated as no due to the extra work required. While this decision is understandable, as a designer, the best decision you can make is to respect player differences whenever possible. Select the appropriate default based on the previous questions, but give players the option to decide what suits their own preferences. In some cases, it may be best to forego the inclusion of a HUD at all, optional or otherwise. Sometimes, everything the players absolutely need to know is shown through their surroundings. For instance, indie darling Limbo strips down the player's experience to something resembling a black and white film with no HUD in sight. The visual choices you make in presenting a HUD can impact its usability and its aesthetic appeal. There are many individual factors that we could identify, but perhaps the best way to quickly grasp the essentials is to review some general design principles. Two are of special interest to HUD design: visibility and consistency. If you expect players to process information, that information needs to be readily visible or audible in the case of audio cues. Having elements that are too small, lack contrast, or are grouped too closely together can all make a HUD harder to interpret. On the right is an example of how an in-game teammate can be made visible and clear. We can use a visually distinct label, an outline, and have that outline visible through level geometry. That way, the player can easily tell who their teammate is and where they are. There are two different types of consistency: external and internal. External consistency is the idea of obeying conventions established by other games. An example is the red health bar, common in role-playing games. If you see a red bar without context, you assume it serves as a health indicator. A game with a blue health bar and a red magic bar would be externally inconsistent, violating the expectations players have based on past experience and taking a lot of time to get used to. Internal consistency is, as you might expect, whether a game adheres to its own established conventions. Mismatches in internal consistency are almost universally bad. Good internal consistency can make it easier for players to navigate a game's HUD and use it effectively in different contexts. Responsive communication. Well-designed games make good use of responsive feedback. Feedback is another one of Norman's design principles. It's a simple idea. Anytime a user takes an action, the system needs to provide an indication of its consequences. Another important part of responsive communication is informing the user of relevant events. Games need to provide feedback on a player's actions, as well as any events that affect them or their character. Naturally, feedback for different events and actions require different considerations. Nonetheless, we can establish a few general rules of thumb for what makes feedback effective. In general, feedback should be immediate, distinct, easy to interpret, and appropriately attention-grabbing. Feedback should be immediate, which means that it needs to happen as soon as possible for players to understand what's going around them, prevent frustration, and inform future decisions. Feedback should be distinct, which means that different actions or events should map to different cues that are easily distinguishable to avoid confusion. Feedback should be easy to interpret. It should be clear so as to not confuse players. And lastly, feedback should be appropriately attention-grabbing. If players are likely to miss out on feedback, it will become a source of frustrated confusions. Regardless of how you choose to go about communicating information to players, remember that it is inseparable from a game's core experience. An interaction isn't just a layer on top of the game, it is a fundamental part of that game. An interaction is about communication, and that communication is linked to the enjoyable, functional, beautiful, memorable experience that games can be. Thank you so much for listening. This video is just a high-level overview of the type of content you can find in Chapter 4. To get the full picture, please check out the game designer's playbook. You can scan this QR code to be taken to the store page. In the book, you'll also find an exclusive interview with Cherry Thompson, Accessibility Project Manager at Ubisoft Montreal.